The town of Chatham on Cape Cod juts into the Atlantic Ocean and Nantucket Sound, absorbing the tides into its active salt marshes. Chatham has many salt marshes. Here are some of them. These salt marshes are important to Chatham because they provide many environmental services, such as protecting coastal homes and businesses from storm impacts by dissipating wave action, absorbing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that fuel climate change, improving water quality by filtering out pollutants and other harsh chemicals before they reach the ocean, providing habitat for many species of fish, shellfish, and migratory birds, responding to sea level rise by building in elevation and migrating upland. Our marshes have been shaped by natural and human influences. In the past, people converted large areas of marsh to cranberry bogs and created roads and housing, which disrupted the tidal flow of creeks. In addition, natural forces along the seashore constantly shifted sediments until the connection of marsh to sea at Cockle Cove Beach was permanently closed off in the 1970s. The bridge over the former Cockle Cove Inlet is shown in old photos contributed by neighbors. The Federal Clean Water Act of 1972 effectively halted human development of wetlands like marshes. Many acres of undevelopable land were donated or sold to the Chatham Conservation Foundation, CCF, Cape Cod's first land trust, started in the 1960s by neighbors to preserve beautiful marshes and woodlands. CCF ownership guarantees preservation in a natural state for perpetuity. While CCF protected the land, it had no resources for maintaining the health of the marshes in the face of invasive non-native weeds. Recently, CCF has begun to restore the health of key properties and has established a salt marsh task force to begin to monitor and restore salt marshes in Chatham. Cockle Cove is one of Chatham's largest salt marsh complexes, with much of the marsh as well as its feeder creeks managed by CCF. The first step in actively preserving and restoring healthy marsh is to research the current functioning of the marsh as an ecosystem involving flowing water, mixing tidal salt water and fresh groundwater, vegetation, marshes, grasses, native and invasive reeds and bushes, animal life, birds, fish, shellfish, small mammals, soil, sedimentation, carbon capture, water filtering. These complex and interrelated factors determine the quality of the marsh and of the services it provides to the environment and to people. Like a gigantic sponge, a salt marsh soaks up seawater at high tide and releases creek and groundwater into the ocean at low tide. With 4 major creeks and general watershed runoff feeding into it, the whole Cockle Cove complex receives tidal influx through one channel from Nantucket Sound, between Ridgevale Beach and Hardings Beach. The water flow through the marsh is complicated. Tidal salt water takes a circuitous route to reach the middle of the complex, where 2 culverts control the further movement of water. An old damaged culvert under Ridgevale Road permits little flow. A newer culvert under Cranberry Lane has restored more natural tidal flow. The primary barrier to healthy marsh functioning is usually restrictions in tidal flushing by roads, agricultural landfill, and man-made walls. That is why we are researching the functioning of the 2 culverts in the middle of Cockle Cove Marsh. The Chatham Conservation Foundation hired APCC, the Association to Preserve Cape Cod, to undertake an initial study of the Cockle Cove Bucks Creek Marsh Complex in summer 2021. APCC's initial study of the marsh includes analysis of tidal flows, vegetation, and water quality. We asked Carl Dupuy, an environmental science teacher and the lead field researcher for the Cockle Cove study, about the importance of marshes.
So we're at the Bucks Creek Cockle Cove Salt Marsh in Chatham, Massachusetts, and what a salt marsh is it's a coastal wetland that grows at the interface between the ocean and the land. And salt marshes are composed of grasses, salt marsh grasses that are native, and also typically a tidal creek which feeds the salt marsh with salt water. So a salt marsh is a coastal wetland that tolerates quite a bit of salt water, but also can tolerate a lot of fresh water. Salt marshes are important because they provide habitat for our coastal nurseries for fish and shellfish, and a lot of the fish and shellfish that we use actually spend part of their life cycle inside a salt marsh or estuary. So they're very valuable in terms of keeping our fisheries healthy. And so they also provide a carbon sink for a lot of the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, because as a salt marsh grows, a lot of the grasses get trapped and decompose in the peat below it, and it traps that carbon underneath the salt marsh. They also are giant sponges, and so when you get a giant coastal storm that comes into a salt marsh, usually the coastal storm will allow water to flood into areas, and it will act as a sponge and soak up a lot of that extra water coming in, which would typically cause a lot of erosion and a lot of houses to be inundated. But salt marshes protect a lot of the houses around here from that happening. So that's why they are important. The way that we monitor salt marshes is we can do a few things. We can look at the actual composition and the type of species of grasses that are growing in the marsh. We can also look at the fish or the shellfish that inhabit the tidal creek in a marsh, but we can also look at the bird life that is around as well, okay? And the one thing that we do to monitor is we typically go out and we look at the composition of the marsh grasses with a quadrat, and we'll look at the species and identify what are there to determine if it's healthy or not. So this is a beautiful, healthy salt marsh. When you look out at a salt marsh that's healthy, you can see that there's a variety of different low-growing grasses that are in the marsh. And an unhealthy salt marsh is on the other side here. It looks like this. You have a lot of the taller growing Phragmites species, which is the tall grass in the background here, which has choked out a lot of the native grasses that would typically be growing there. Phragmites is an invasive species from Eurasia, and it does very well in fresh and brackish water ecosystems. And it's growing right now because it has established itself, and once it establishes itself, it continues to grow throughout the marsh, and it outcompetes the native species. It's very hard to manage because once it gets established, it continues to spread out into areas that it can outcompete native species. Yeah, so one way to manage invasives and Phragmites is by increasing the saltwater flow into a marsh system. And the way that is done is that there are tidal creeks which come into a salt marsh, and historically what humans have done is they have usually built roads or filled marshes, and in doing that they restrict the tidal flow or salt water that goes into a marsh system. And one way to restore a marsh and try to get rid of Phragmites is by opening that open culvert, which is an opening underneath a road, which allows more salt water to flush into an ecosystem and then hopefully cause the Phragmites to die back. So what we test to see if the water quality is good is we will test for nitrogen and phosphorus. In more saline environments, we'll test for nitrogen. In more freshwater environments, we'll test for phosphorus. So what we're doing at Bucks Creek is we're actually testing for both nitrogen in more saline environments and phosphorus in the more freshwater environments to see if there's an influence or an influx of nutrients coming through the system, which might be having an influence on the Phragmites and this ecosystem. So what we do in a marsh is we also want to see how high the tidal creek is and what the temperature is and what the salinity is of the tides coming into the marsh, because that has a huge influence on what kind of plants can grow there and if Phragmites is being controlled. So we set up these level loggers, and a level logger is just a little data logger which is placed in the marsh, and This will collect data every 5 minutes of salinity, temperature, and water level heights. And we do this for over a month to get a full tidal cycle, to see how high the tide is getting during a full moon, new moon tidal cycle. And what it does is it's sending and collecting data and storing it inside a computer chip inside here. And then what we're going to do is we'll bring this back to the lab, we'll hook it up, and we'll be able to see variations throughout daily and monthly cycle to see how it's changing on the different sides and different parts of the marsh. So that'll give us a good indicator of what's happening hydraulically in the marsh. So the technique that we're using to monitor the salt marsh today it's an area-based sampling method. So when we talk about an area, we're talking about a square area, and in this case we're using a 1 meter square quadrat to sample this location. And what we're doing is we're identifying each individual species of plant in the quadrat, and then what we're going to do is we're going to determine its percent cover using a sheet that we use as a guide, which tells us how much percent coverage there is for each of those species. So that gives us a basis of understanding what kind of species are here and the health of the salt marsh. Marsh elder is the common name for that, and it's called Iva frutescens, the scientific name. We have this one here, a little grass, but it's got a flower that is it's inflorescence, they call it, and this is called salt marsh hay, or Spartina patens. This one here is marsh orac, and the scientific name is Atriplex patula. So those are just some of the species that are in the quadrat here.
The Chatham Conservation Foundation is concerned about the future of the local salt marshes. Here you see a projection of the Cockle Cove area in less than 50 years. With 3 feet of sea level rise flooding the marshes, beaches, and many roads and homes, unless the marshes can grow and migrate in response to the changes. We want to ensure that there are areas for the marsh to migrate to as the sea level rises, so we try to own and protect adjacent wetlands. As stewards of the land, we need to track the marsh ecosystems over time. We want to monitor the presence of native plants, fish, birds, and animals, so we know if they are continuing to thrive. We also want to optimize the growth of salt marsh grasses that sequester carbon. Preserving healthy marshes is the most effective way to lower the carbon footprint of Chatham. Healthy salt marshes are key to Chatham's future economy, climate change resilience, and natural beauty.